Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. I'm joined by Sheldon Richman, the foundation's vice president. This is the Libertarian Angle, the show that, as you well know, brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. And Sheldon, we especially see this phenomenon, it seems to me, with this Ukraine crisis. I mean, one of the most amusing aspects of this is the mainstream press, both in Russia and here in the United States. In Russia, it's no surprise, the media outlets there are, rallying to the Russian government, spouting out the Russian government's defense of what it's doing in the Crimea. But it's really no different here in the United States. The mainstream press, the networks, the big newspapers are all rallying to the U.S. government, condemning Russian aggression, and I'm amused by it all because it looks to me like the mainstream press in both countries are really just official mouthpieces of the government. I mean, who needs a department of propaganda when you've got the mainstream media in your country ready to rally to your defense, whatever you happen to do?
Yeah, it's an old point made by Noam Chomsky about the American media that it couldn't more faithfully toe the official line if it were all owned by the U.S. government outright. I mean, it's about as lockstep as you can get. They're so interested in having access to the officials that they don't do things that will alienate those officials. They want to get them on their programs. They want to be able to talk to them on background, and so things stay within a pretty narrow band. I mean, that's changed significantly with the internet, so that people aren't so dependent on the mainstream media, and that probably has a little influence on the media itself, the mainstream media itself. But I agree that it's pretty much towing the line. You rarely, and I say this and I hope no one will interpret this as my being pro-Putin, because I'm not. But you rarely have the American media, the mainstream media, try to get inside Putin's head and look at Western and American and European policy from his vantage point, just in an attempt to understand it, to make some sense of it, not to sympathize with it. They don't even do that, and that leaves the American people in the dark, and it's a real disservice.
I think that's a great point. I mean, I think the wisest leaders are the ones in history that have been able to do that, to look into the mindset of the opponent and figure out how is it that he's arriving at his position. I mean, John Kennedy was doing that. He was a master at it during the Cuban Missile Crisis, constantly while he was getting, advice from his advisors in the military, the Pentagon, the CIA. Hey, just get in there and start bombing. Just get in there and invade. So what if we have a nuclear war? Kennedy was sitting there trying to analyze constantly, why is Khrushchev doing this? What is motivating him? And also figuring out a face-saving way that for Khrushchev to extricate himself from the crisis. And to me, that reflects true, genuine wisdom. And of course, the result was that the entire crisis got deactivated. I don't see Obama doing that at all. It seems to me that all he's doing is trying to paint Putin into a corner and leave him no exit at all, much less a face-saving exit. And, okay, what would that entail? And as you point out, the only time you're going to get some real independent analysis here is on the Internet, and primarily from libertarians. I mean, yeah, there's a few liberals, progressives that are not rallying to Obama in this thing, blindly supporting his position. There's maybe one or two conservatives. But by and large, it's the libertarians that are saying, hey, this is the independent thinking on this. And if you look at Putin's standpoint, you can't help but look at what NATO has done. I mean, here you have this Cold War institution that was brought into existence to oppose the World War II ally and partner of the U.S., the Soviet Union. And then when the Soviet Union dismantles, NATO stays in existence. And even worse, it not only stays in existence, it starts expanding eastward. It starts incorporating all the Eastern Bloc countries that had been occupied by the Soviet Union. So you see this constant encroachment of troops, or the possibility of bases, missiles, getting closer and closer to Russia. how could this not precipitate a crisis? It seems to me if you couldn't find a better formula than to keep moving closer and closer to Russia with this kind of encroachment.
Yeah, that I agree, and we have an interesting ally in these days who I wouldn't have predicted, but Henry Kissinger himself wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post the other day, so you can find it at anywar.com, pointing that out, that it's a mistake to look at this as a confrontation between Russia and the United States, and even proposes some ways, that things could be de-intensified, take all the pressure off. We may not endorse all those because it's more activist than we would want, but at least it's sort of in the right vein. We should not be seeing this as a confrontation of between Russia and the United States. We should not be ignoring Russia's historical sphere of influence around there. I mean, Ukraine and Crimea in particular has been a part of Russia for a very long time. Crimea's figured in some of the wars Russia has been in, so it's always going to be important to Russia, and therefore we need to look at it that way. That doesn't mean Putin's right. It doesn't mean he should have sent troops in. It doesn't mean he should be trying to control the media there in the build up to this referendum on Crimea joining Russia. Those are all heavy-handed and outrageous tactics. But the U.S. and NATO and the West in general never look at their policies from the other side. Our side will claim, Obama and the West will claim, but we've only done things that are defensive in nature. But the thing is, even if you believe that, you need to be, let's assume, just for the sake of argument, they sincerely believe putting anti-missile systems in Czech Republic or Poland or doing these other things, moving NATO up to the very borders of Russia. Even if you, in your heart of hearts, believe that's purely defensive, a smart person would still say, but how does it look to the other side? Okay, I may believe it's defensive, but how does it look? And a defensive, something isn't objectively defensive. It can appear offensive. Even an anti-missile system, you might say, well, anti-missile system, that's just to knock down missiles. That's not to launch missiles. Except it maybe protect you. It can look like you're planning, from the other side, it can look like you're planning to launch missiles and you want to be able to defend yourselves against retaliation. So there's nothing objectively defensive about a particular system or move or system of alliances, because it can be used offensively also. And our side, I keep saying our side, the U.S. government and NATO and the West are constantly oblivious to that. And then you get moves like this, and everybody's running around like their hair's on fire.
Well, and if things were turned around and it was the Russians doing this or the Chinese doing this, I mean, remember what happened when the Russians put in nuclear missiles in Cuba? I mean, we came to the verge of nuclear war because of it. And remember all of the activity in Latin America, Reagan's Contras and so forth, the regime change in Chile in 1973, the invasion of the Bay of Pigs. It was all with this notion of, my gosh, they're encircling us. The communists are going to come and get us. And I mean, if our government suffered from that kind of paranoia, why would they think that the Russian government, that had been invaded twice by Germany in the space of 25 years, would be any less paranoid? And so here you've got, the U.S. encroaching. You've got Gorbachev saying back in I think it was an interview in 2009, saying they promised that they wouldn't expand NATO eastward. So here you have the Soviet Union dismantling, the Berlin Wall's being torn down, the Soviet Union's getting out of Eastern Europe. But it looks to me like for the U.S., the Cold War didn't end at all. I mean, imagine how great things would have been if NATO had been dismantled, if the national security state had been dismantled, the CIA, the NSA, the big standing army, the empire. In other words, all the things that came into existence supposedly because of the Cold War, things would be totally different. Russia wouldn't feel this sense of anxiety with the expansion of NATO into, Albania, Croatia, Czech Republic, Slovenia, Slovakia. I mean, it's incredible. But notice something else here. If the U.S. ends up succeeding in getting a puppet regime into Ukraine, They've already announced that they want Ukraine part of NATO too. So what does that mean? It seems to me it places all of Ukraine in the subservient role that the U.S. wants them in under the jurisdiction of the United States, indirectly through NATO. Doesn't that put all those military installations that Russia has in Crimea then under U.S. NATO control as well? Doesn't then NATO have jurisdiction over those? How could they not foresee that? I mean, why is it illogical for Russia to say, we can't permit if we're going to permit a puppet regime belonging to the U.S. in Ukraine, we certainly can't let our military installations in Ukraine and in Crimea come under that jurisdiction. We've got to invade now and absorb Crimea so that whatever happens in Ukraine, they're not going to be able to take our access to the Black Sea away from us. How could they not foresee that as part of the U.S. empire? It seems to me it's like a no-brainer.
Yeah, no, I think they did. I think they did foresee it just because it's so obvious. And we can get a little bit cynical about this, but maybe they want a crisis of this nature because they think some good things will come out of it. Again, this doesn't make Putin a good guy. Russia has always, long been interested in having a buffer of friendly states between it and the West. It was invaded, through Eastern Europe 3 times in the 20th century, twice by Germany and once by Poland between the wars. So, you can see how it has a natural interest in having, like I say, a buffer between itself and the Western and the West. And I know how, you were saying, why don't they see this or why don't they realize this? One of the things, of course, is that the leaders in the West feel they're the good guys and Russia are the bad guys. And so, they can say that's why it's different. That's why it's different from, say, the Cuban Missile Crisis when Russia put missiles in Cuba, because we're the good guys and they're bad. But again, you have to look at these policies from the other side. And the question is, do you want confrontations? Do you want crises on a regular basis? Or do you want some sort of stability where people then are in an atmosphere where they can trade and produce and make their lives better? If you want the latter, which is, what we want, then it seems to me you don't go out of your way to provoke someone who's already on edge and nervous, given their history, that maybe you don't have good intentions. I mean, so that's the question. That's what makes me suspect maybe they want a crisis. I think they'll get some good out of it.
I think it's a great point. I remember Brzezinski's statement when after the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. He said, this is fantastic. We have sucked them into this, and now we're going to give them their Vietnam. And we all know that after the Cold War ended, the national security state was very nervous because people were raising questions about the peace dividend. We were raising questions of what do you need a national security state for anymore? I mean, the Cold War brought it into existence and the Cold War's over. Time to dismantle it. And so they went into the Middle East, as we know. They started provoking hornet's nests there, poking hornet's nests. And we end up with the Persian Gulf intervention, the sanctions, the no-fly zones, all the other stuff that ultimately ended up with all the terrorist strikes, including 9/11. But at the same time, it's clear that they were moving eastward with this expansion of NATO, that Russia's ending of the Cold War had no effect on them. And there's another factor here, Sheldon, and I'm not sure if many Americans have realized this, that by incorporating all these people and all these countries into NATO, what the national security state has really done is pledge the lives of the American people in a military defense of these countries. Now, notice there's no treaties there, mutual defense treaties. There was no national debate over whether we should do this. There was no congressional vote. But all of a sudden now, if Russia gets into a war with any of these countries, Latvia, Lithuania, or whatever, that commits the United States to a war against Russia. That means conscription, the draft, untold numbers of people killed. It's assuming that they're able to limit it to a non-nuclear conventional war. Well, what kind of business is that where Americans are automatically committed in advance to be dying for all these countries without any congressional debate, declaration of war, or anything?
Well, about 18% of Americans polled don't think it's any of our business. But I do have to raise this issue of NATO. The T in NATO stands for treaty. The Senate did ratify a treaty in 1940, 6 or 7. Robert Taft led the charge against it, but he lost. And so it's a treaty, and under the Constitution, it's part of the supreme law of the land. And this is worth spending a few moments on. A treaty, the NATO treaty in particular, but it's typical of a treaty, means that an attack on one member is an attack on all. That was the point of NATO, at least the stated point, right back during the days of the Cold War, post-World War II. The idea was if Russia's going to move westward, and overrun a Western European country, like Western Germany or France or anything else, that was like attacking all the members of NATO, and therefore all of NATO would respond. So now part of NATO includes, like you say, the Warsaw Pact countries, Poland, Hungary, etc., and other countries that were part of the Soviet bloc, the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and the states in the Balkans, Albania. And then, like you say, they want to move Ukraine and Georgia, which I talked about, another former Soviet republic that Russia fought with in 2008 over separatist provinces. They want to bring those into NATO, and they're almost members of NATO as it is, because NATO has a thing called Partnership for Peace, and those two former republics are members of this NATO Partnership for Peace. So they're virtual members. They're almost like halfway there to membership. So that's very dangerous. But that's the question Americans need to ponder, and it sounds like if they pondered it, they're on our side. Are we willing to go to war over Ukraine or Georgia? Now, a Russian war with those countries would, of course, be terrible. Innocent people would get killed. Innocent people died in 2008, and we would hate to see that. But does that mean the U.S. should then turn it into a wider war, a world war, which, as you mentioned before, could become a nuclear war? And I heard over the weekend from Stephen Cohen, a Russian scholar at Princeton and NYU, that NATO has already moved troops into eastern Poland. That means close. That means on the border there with Ukraine. And that's a very dangerous move. And it's enough to make us a little nervous.
Well, they're sending fighter jets into there too, into these Warsaw Pact countries. And I mean, your point about a treaty is well taken, but look, if you have a treaty in 1949, there's a general intent there, and that is it intends to protect the Western European countries from a Soviet attack. Now, all of a sudden, they've expanded the membership into this organization that includes all these Warsaw Pact countries. My point is that when did we ever vote on that? Where was the intent when NATO got established to do something like that? Obviously, that would have been considered ridiculous. So what they've done, U.S. officials, is expand the defense commitment, which means the American people, the young people, husbands, sons, maybe even women involved in this. Well, there's women in the armed forces, but you're looking at a draft if there's a war with Russia. But they've expanded it to include the defense of these countries with no national debate, no new treaty, no treaty revision. They just did it. A little stroke of the pen here. And I wonder how many people realize that, how many Americans realize it now, that your husbands, maybe your wives, your sons or whatever, are now committed to the defense of what used to be members of the Warsaw Pact.
Well, that's right. That's right. It's certainly something that politically people should be upset about. I'm not sure about the legality of it. It may well be totally legal, but that doesn't mean it's the right thing to do or politically the right thing to do because the government set up the terms, right? In addition to membership creep, we could call it, there's long been mission creep. I mean, what business did NATO have in Afghanistan? It's there. It's in a subordinate role to the U.S., but NATO is in Afghanistan. NATO was involved in the bombing and other warlike actions in Libya. What's that got to do with NATO? NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What's that got to do with the North Atlantic? Turkey's long been a member of NATO. It's not very close to the North Atlantic last time I looked at a map. So mission creep has been going on for a very long time, and now along with this membership creep. And you mentioned Gorbachev and the assurances that NATO wouldn't expand. That's not just Gorbachev saying that. And it's well known that during the administration of George H.W. Bush, the Secretary of State, James Baker, talked to Gorbachev, and they were discussing Germany. This is as with the scheduled dismantling of the Soviet Union, which happened around Christmas of 1991. The Bush administration assured Gorbachev that if they didn't in any way resist the reunification of Germany, in other words, Russia leaving Germany, that NATO would not expand eastward. And of course, that promise was broken. That was an explicit promise made to Gorbachev, and it was broken.
Yeah, and I mean, I really think this goes back to the founding principles of this country. I mean, you've got these long-standing disputes in Europe. I mean, and the founding fathers understood that. They said, Europe's been filled with wars. The whole history of Europe is filled with wars, and there's these disputes and these alliances that most of us don't even understand. They go back centuries. And the idea was, and when America got founded, is, look, we're going to stay out of that. The United States is going to stay out of all that mess, and we're going to stay here and establish a free society as a model for the world. And now it's the exact opposite. Notice that here we have another crisis with the U.S. over there. The crisis isn't over here. The crisis is over there. And, isn't it interesting that the U.S. with NATO is right over there embroiled in the middle of this crisis? Now, there's another angle to this, Sheldon, and that's this secessionist thing that's taking place where Russia takes the position that, hey, let the Crimeans have this referendum to secede from Ukraine and become part of Russia. And so they've now scheduled this referendum. Ukraine is saying, no, we object to this. You don't have our permission. The U.S. is objecting, saying this is illegitimate. Putin's coming back and saying, hey, your whole government in Ukraine is illegitimate because you've just ousted a democratically elected president and installed a bunch of right-wing unelected radicals. What's your take on that?
Well, that gets extremely interesting now. First of all, the idea that the sort of central government has to approve of a secession or a referendum before there can be a vote on a secession sounds like a little bit like the fix is in. It's more complicated by the fact, as you were alluding to just then, is that this new government in Ukraine is not even a lawful government in just conventional terms. There's question whether the former president of Ukraine, the gentleman who fled and I guess is now in Russia, whether he was lawfully impeached. I've seen material saying they didn't follow the law of the Ukrainian constitution in impeaching him. And I noticed over the weekend that Fareed Zakaria, who's a fairly mainstream foreign policy analyst, he's not somebody just who's considered on the fringe by any means. He called it an extra constitutional move by the parliament to get rid of the former president. And so that doesn't sound legal. So if that's not legal, the new government really isn't legal, again, just using conventional terms here. And so how can that government object to a vote on whether an autonomous part of the country, and Crimea does have autonomy, and self-rule, whether it can leave. So that's that side of it. The other side of it is, the Russians aren't just standing aside saying, okay, you guys vote to join, whether to join. It's not just a secession. The question in the referendum is whether they'll join Russia, not become an independent country. Putin is not just letting that happen. He's meddling himself, right? He's I understand there's been media closed down that would tend to be sympathetic to Ukraine. And then another complication, just to throw this in while we're talking, about 60% of Crimea are Russian-speaking, culturally Russian people. About 12% are Muslim Tartars, And they presumably don't want. And then the remainder is about our Ukrainians. So they presumably, which together they don't constitute a majority. The Russians still are a majority. They presumably wouldn't want to join Russia. So the question is, what happens? I mean, I generally support the principle of secession, because I don't think a government should be able to hold a group of people. But what if within that group there's a group that doesn't want to, change affiliations? I mean, they ought to be able to secede too, right? So we're now getting secession down lower and lower and lower. As Murray Rothbard used to say, he favored secession down to the individual level. So it's not a simple question. It's extremely interesting, but both sides at least should keep their hands off. I mean, all the different sides, the West, the central government in Ukraine, and the Russians, the Russian government, Putin's government.
Yeah, and there's a lot of hypocrisy on the part of the U.S. here. I mean, it wasn't too long ago when the U.S. was favoring the secession of Kosovo from Serbia, and they actually helped them accomplish that. And I don't think that we can discount the possibility that the CIA and USAID and this financial support that they give to pro-democracy groups, that has played a role in the chaos in Ukraine. I mean, this is a standard CIA type activity, where they stir up these crises and they're covert, they deny it, and then when the files are opened a few decades later, it turns out that they were behind it. And we can't do anything to fix Russia. It shouldn't be the role of the U.S. government to try to police the world. But I just can't help but imagine that the world would be a lot more secure, pleasant, peaceful place if the U.S. wasn't up there stirring all of these crises and chaos. We see it now with this expansion eastward through NATO. I mean, how could Russia have reacted any differently? You see, it seems to me that the U.S. government, after the Cold War, wanted Russia to assume a subservient role, like Great Britain does. It's like sort of the U.S.'s poodle, or Egypt, or Mexico, or any of the Latin American regimes that are on the U.S. dole. The way this empire works is that the U.S. lets its subservient regimes have carte blanche in doing whatever they want within their countries. So it doesn't matter that Egypt right now is trouncing all of the protesters and the demonstrations and killing people and so forth. That's it. The U.S. is indifferent to that. But the U.S. expects Egypt to perform its role within the international empire. They need a place to torture people. Egypt's ready to provide that means with rendition and so forth. They need a vote in the United Nations. Mexico's ready to do it. I think that's what they wanted Russia to do at the end of the Cold War, is you become subservient to us. We're in the empire. You will have free reign within your country, but you're going to do as you're told. And that just never was going to happen. Russia was never going to play a subservient role. There's too much pride there, too much nationalism. And so it was going to be a foregone conclusion that Russia was never going to let go of those military bases in Crimea. They were never going to place those bases under the control of NATO or the U.S. empire. And it all just goes back to show, Sheldon, that if libertarians can prevail with our philosophy of non-interventionism, the world is going to be a much more peaceful, secure, prosperous place. And I think that's what Americans need to face, is we've got a conflict of visions here. On the one side, you've got the interventionists that have made their big mess with Vietnam, Korea, the whole Cold War, the Iraq, Afghanistan, and now this crisis, the latest one. Oh, by the way, notice we're not talking about the Islamo-fascist threat anymore. Remember that one where the Muslims were coming to get us? They've been waging war for thousands of years. Now, all of a sudden, the new crisis is Russia. I mean, it's crisis to crisis to crisis to crisis. And that's the reason why our vision should prevail here, the libertarian vision. Sure.
I agree with that. I would only add that we shouldn't assume that Putin will automatically become, a Boy Scout if the U.S. were to adopt a non-interventionist foreign policy. I don't think he's not any threat to the American people. I think if the U.S. is going to have any direct relations, government relations with Putin, it ought to be about dismantling the nuclear weapons on both sides. That's the biggest favor they could do to humanity, is for both sides to dismantle their nukes. Russia may still be, I say Russia, I mean Putin and the rulers, for the reasons you pointed out, may still be mischievous in their own neighborhood, but that's not a threat to us, and hopefully the people there who are threatened by Russia or pressured by Russia, let's say, will find means to resist that and make it too costly for Russia. That would, I wouldn't want to live next to Russia either. That'd make me nervous. But they need to find their ways to deal with that. Finland has managed to find it, and Finland's an interesting case because Finland has all kinds of dealings with the West. It's not hemmed in, but it made assurances to Russia back before World War II broke out, I believe, or maybe when it was just in the beginning of the war. It made assurances to Russia that it would never threaten Russia and it would not allow itself to be a staging ground for an attack on Russia. And Russia pretty much leaves Finland alone. It trades with anybody it wants, the people do. And it's not under the thumb. It never was under the thumb the way the Warsaw Pact countries were, or the republics were. So, I think I agree with you. The U.S. needs to back away. Let's concentrate on getting rid of the nukes. And I don't think we need to worry about what Putin is going to do. You were mentioning traditional American foreign policy. It's a good time to maybe mention the Monroe Doctrine, which was in fact written by John Quincy Adams. That said, we wash our hands of Europe. We're not going to get involved in Europe's quarrels. They're far away and they're not our business. At the same time, this is maybe the downside of the Monroe Doctrine. It did claim that the Americas, the Western Hemisphere, these continents, North and South America, were our backyard, and Europe better stay out. Well, so why don't we see Russia being able to say the same thing about its backyard? Again, not defending Russian incursions into those neighboring countries, but isn't it only taking the same attitude toward its neighboring, its bordering countries that Quincy Adams and Monroe took regarding the Americas? I don't see the difference. And
the same position that the Cold Warriors took during the Cold War about communists in Nicaragua and Cuba and so forth. And your point about dictators existing overseas, brutal dictators, and despite that if we did have a policy of foreign interventionism, is very well taken. But this is what John Quincy Adams was saying in that famous address to Congress on the 4th of July, where he said, yeah, there's monsters overseas. There's dictators, brutal dictators. They're invading countries. There's war. There's conflict. There's oppression. There's starvation. But America's troops are not going to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. That the troops are going to stay here to protect America from an attack, much like Switzerland. The foreign policy of Switzerland is based on their military policy, and that we establish a free society here at home as a model for the world. In any event, Sheldon, we're out of time. That's the show. This is the Libertarian Angle with Sheldon Richman and Jacob Hornberger. Nice to be with y'all. We'll see you next time.